Welcome, everyone. Lovely to have you all with us this morning. I'm Charlene Cranny, the Senior Programme Manager for the Climate Governance Initiative's Financial Sector Programme. And this is a brand new programme recently launched with the aim to bring together finance sector board directors across the globe, starting with our brilliant chapter network to guide, share experiences and knowledge, and co-create tools to empower directors to provide outstanding leadership when it comes to climate and other interconnected environmental and social risks. We are delighted to partner with the UK chapter, Chapter Zero, the membership organisation for board directors in the UK, to deliver what is essentially our first webinar for the programme, and the one where we are asking the starting question: how are we all doing? Where are we at? Where are we starting from today? So we're delighted to have Andrea Webster and Paul Druckman with us today. Andrea Webster is Head of Finance System Transformation at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and Paul Druckman is Supervisory Board Chair at the WBA and Chapter Zero Fellow. And they're here to provide a special and interactive presentation on the recently published and highly respected financial system benchmark, measuring and ranking the 400 most influential financial institutions across the globe. I'll be passing over to Andrea in the next couple of minutes, but before I do, please notice the mentee information at the top of the presentation there, because we will be asking a couple of polling questions today. So I suggest setting that up on your browser or smartphone now, as we have a warm-up questions coming up shortly. And we are recording, and we want this to be an open conversation as much as possible. So do use the chat, ask lots of questions, share your challenges, and put your hand up as well during the Q&A so we can hear your questions too. We have about an hour, which will no doubt fly by, so don't miss the chance to hear from Andrea and Paul directly on what matters to you on this topic. So let's warm up by asking our first question before passing over to Andrea. So I hope you have your mentees on your screens. There's a Q&R code as well, which you can use to set it up if you've had problems with the website and the code at the top. Right, so how well do you think your financial institution is doing on sustainability leadership? So if you want to submit your answers into the poll, then it should come up automatically on the screen. Excellent. We'll give one more minute if there are any more answers that you'd like to share with us. Okay, we'll leave that one there, and then we'll move on to our next question, which is a one that Andrea will speak to as she moves into her presentation. What would push sustainability higher up the boardroom agenda? Government pressure, fiduciary duty, business risk, business opportunity or efficiency, employee and or stakeholder pressure, or if the business decides it's the right thing to do. So how about submitting your answers to this one now?
Yeah, I'm really interested to get a feel for where the audience are and what pushes this onto the agenda. Yeah.
Amazing. There we go. Fantastic.
I was expecting that to be the first one. That makes me happy. And hopefully as I get into the presentation and the Q&As, we can dig into some of these.
Oh, there we go. It's fun to see those answers change and move around.
Oh, nice to see. Our business decides it's the right thing to do. That is really uplifting.
Yeah. Okay. Should we move into the presentation, Andrea?
Let's get stuck in.
Great.
It's a pleasure to be here and thank you for joining. I have 20 minutes for this presentation. We have a huge amount of data in here and I'm going to share a tiny snapshot with you. I really hope with the 15 minutes Q&A we have at the end that we can really get stuck into a little bit more of the detail and I can perhaps provide more insight and that you're not going to see on a presentation slide. And then Paul and I, in our fireside chat and the Q&As afterwards, I really hope we can bring this subject alive. I do also want to start off and mention, what authority do I have to be here talking to a lot of you who I imagine are very experienced as well by virtue of the fact that you're a NED or on a board. Yes, I've had the privilege of heading the finance system transformation at World Benchmarking Alliance for the last 3 years. But before that, I've spent 25 years in finance. I was licensed myself as responsible officer on advising, dealing in securities and asset management. And I've held that criminal liability that goes with it. I was also previously a NED on a hedge fund. So yeah, I understand this. I know that the external environment is changing rapidly, but I do want you to know that there is empathy here as well. I do also currently sit within a family office network as well. So that's a really interesting insight around governance structures. But I think governance is king. The role that you all play on boards is vital. And I really hope we have a great discussion today. Before I get into the finance system benchmark, I'm hoping that everybody knows the World Benchmarking Alliance. But just a refresher for those of you that don't, we are a non-profit organisation and we are benchmarking the top 2,000 companies and institutions in the world. Why the top 2,000? We want to drive system level change. And we believe that by changing the behavior of those top 2,000 companies, institutions, it will ripple through those systems and have the transformational impact that that we need to see. Those 2,000 companies, their GDP, their revenue accounts for approximately a third of global GDP. Directly, they employ nearly 100 million people and many hundreds of millions more indirectly. So they are incredibly consequential to our lives. The finance system wraps around it, and I like to call it the connective tissue of all the other systems that exist. So that is what we focus on and why the financial system is so incredibly important. We benchmark 2,000 companies. I'm going to focus on the 400 financial institutions today, but I think just want to point out as well, we are going to be assessing all 2,000 at the same time. It is a huge task, but we can see the interrelationship between the companies and the institutions absolutely key. So in January 2026, we will be sharing the findings of those 2,000. So yes, please pay attention. There is a lot that's coming out from us. Next slide, please. So in terms of the financial system benchmark, it is unique in that it has all the key institutions that are involved in the full investment and financing decision-making process. I know there are a lot of other non-profits and associations that are tracking finance. I don't think there is one that has all the full financial institutions that follow the flow of money. Everybody knows that we need alignment to open up the flow of money to get to scale and speed, and that is what this is intending to do. These 400 institutions account for about 200 trillion of decision making, so it is key that we can see what the current state of affair is, who are the leaders, and what's the pathway forward. I do also want to point out as well that we are not standard setters ourselves. We look at all the existing principles, all the standards and the frameworks that are out there, pull them into a methodology to provide a guiding star. And I think for you as board members, when you're trying to cut through the noise, I expect that the tools and the methodologies and the results that come through WBA across the finance system and the other benchmarks will help give you a guidance of where the pathway forward is. We're global as well. I know we've got a global audience today, so I just want to emphasize here that we do cover globally. The biggest continent represented is North America, then Asia and Europe, but we are looking at institutions in other regions as well. Typically, there's assets and revenue, but we are also looking at institutions that have an outsized influence, so where they've got a large market share. Next slide. I'm conscious that Chapter 0 and the focus of many of the work from CGI at the moment is obviously on climate and transition planning. However, our measurement areas cover a broad range of issues. Again, I'm sure you're all aware that the interconnection between them is becoming more critical than ever. Obviously, we look at climate, and we're looking at nature. The intersection between those are really important. But also we are looking at the social issues, the ethical business practices, responsible business conduct, respecting individuals and society. And I think perhaps where that's been left behind before is now playing out in the politics. So I think it's going to be really interesting that we dig into those. Obviously, strategy, governance and stewardship, you can see there is 20%. I think, and I'm sure everybody in here is going to agree, the starting point of all of this is the strategy that's set and top down, toned from the top. So although it represents 20% of our measurement areas, I do think it has an outside influence on the other indicators as well. We have about 50,000 data points here. I cannot touch all of them in the time frame that we have, but everything that we do is freely and openly available. So I'm hoping I can touch on some of these points, but do loop back afterwards if you want more. Now, because we cover so many different measurement areas, I've pulled out 5 key findings. These 5 key findings are based on what I hear globally, where I see the key discussions taking place at the moment, and I hope they provide some focal point to yourselves as well in terms of what you pay attention to and where the frontiers are on sustainability. Next slide, please. I really hope we can dig into this in the Q&A. In our methodology, we have indicators that are based on commitment, and we have what we call impact indicators as well, which is process and where we want to see where action's taking place. And one of the points that we can see out, we've seen an improvement from the last benchmark in 2022 on actually assigning responsibility to sustainability across an organization. That's risen to 60%. But where we're seeing the shortfall now, and I hear this echoed in my conversations within finance, is actually how do we link it to real world impact? And for me, I think that's the mindset of moving from compliance to a strategic way of thinking. I think Paul and I will be digging into the questions as well, and I welcome your questions on it. But we need to be now moving from, this is what the commitment is. Obviously, the macro environment at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about the rollback of commitments, but actually how do we move forward and have a real impact and bring more people on side with it? Next slide. Now, this one might be peculiar for some people to see in terms of emerging markets, but when we're talking about decarbonisation, it doesn't respect boundaries. There isn't what you focus on in your own domestic market and decarbonisation there. We need to be thinking on a global scale. I think everybody recognises that the net zero battle is going to be won and lost in emerging markets. And even those institutions that sit outside it have a responsibility to what's happening within those emerging markets. And money is flowing in the wrong direction at the moment. Digging into FDI numbers and even just the allocations to emerging markets, they're shrinking. Money takes the path of least resistance like water, and it's going to take intent to move it in the opposite direction. And that, I think, is going to need a board down mandate. I know that there are people on this call who sit in emerging markets that probably have opinions. Again, I would love to dig into this, into the Q&As. Next slide. This one's interesting. Nature. So in what we've seen here, again, we've seen an improvement from 2022 to 2025 on actually financial institutions assessing and identifying their impact on nature. And I think this is higher than we expect it to be. We also assess what we call real economy companies in some of our other benchmarks. And the percentage of real economy companies assessing their impact is actually lower than what finance are doing. So finance is actually ahead of the curve on this. And I do believe this is because it represents a systemic risk. I'm sure everybody knows that nature represents 50% of global GDP. That number is bounded around a lot, but finance have picked up on this. This is financially material and they're paying attention to it. Where the shortfall is at the moment is that only a small percentage of institutions actually have a plan to address it. It's a nascent issue. Obviously, we've seen the likes of Goldman Sachs coming out recently with a nature bond, and we've seen BlackRock coming in there, but they are sniffing an opportunity here. I think when we talk about impact, I think this is obviously wrapped up in regional institutions, and I will touch on it as we look in the regional breakdown. But I think as a NED and a board member, this is going to gain momentum at speed once there are pathways forward that institutions see that they can move forward on it. And I think as a board member and a NED, it is important to flag this. Next slide. This one is controversial, but I think really important, again, because of the context of the audience and our hosts today. I know that when you look at Bloomberg's numbers and GFAN's members on transition planning, I think the number comes out at around 65%, whereas our figure comes out at 3%. What we look at, obviously we are looking at public disclosures. And I think that's a really important point that I would like to get into in the Q&A. I think your role as a NED and a board member will be setting the tone for compliance and legal teams in terms of what is disclosed and the level of transparency. So how do you set a tone so that the compliance teams aren't pulling back on disclosures and where we can see what's happening, but also we want to see really comprehensive processes and steps, not just a commitment. And so when we're looking at those financial institutions, we're looking at the commitment, their interim measures, but we're also looking at the steps of their process, and we can't see it at the moment. So I would love to dig into this 3% number with you in the Q&A. Next question. Next slide. Okay, again, I think given the macro environment at the moment and the fight that's happening in Europe with the omnibus and the due diligence legislation, but I really do want to emphasize the point on human rights. So voluntary commitments around ILO, the International Labour Organizations, respecting human rights. We see a lot of financial institutions that state that they follow them and they're going to commit to them. 25% of institutions do, but what we can't see is the process, what they've got in place of actually doing it. Like, what's the first step of identifying those human rights? And as we start linking back to transition planning and the just transition as it's being labelled, we need to be bringing people on side. We will not have a climate transition without a social one. I know that phrase again has been used a lot, but protecting human rights and identifying them, having a process is absolutely crucial. And despite what is happening in the US around, this isn't DEI, this is about bringing people with us in the transition. So there is a important bank of work that's taking place with businesses on side, that this is becoming a business risk, not just a social risk. if we're going to use an example, we see what happened in Sri Lanka with what some of the sustainability rules that were put in place and how that spiraled out of control, economically brought down a government and the outcome of it. We have to learn from that. So voluntary commitments have been there for decades. They don't work. There needs to be regulation around this, and we need more businesses to be talking up about how the social risk is actually leading to instability and can lead to financial risk. Next slide. I want to provide some context on this as well, because I'm very conscious that these are big, high-level, sweeping comments on 400 institutions. Next slide. Number one in this benchmark is a Malaysian bank. And I think that is really important to emphasize that it isn't just European institutions that are leading on this. When you dig into the data, you can actually see regional variation. I think it's really some of the interesting points here that really stand out for me. The second bar in each of here are Europe. But I think it's quite interesting. You look at Africa. I think a big part of what's driving up from the African perspective here, one, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange was the poster child on the frameworks for disclosure, voluntary frameworks. And a lot of the South African institutions and African institutions are embracing those. So we have visibility on it, and there is a framework that they're following. So I think that is what's pushing them up here. I do also think it's interesting in terms of inclusive finance and responsible business conduct. The backdrop, the social backdrop in these nations makes it, they need a social license to operate. And therefore the balance between climate priorities versus social priorities is mirrored in these findings. Again, I look at Latin America. It's the fourth pillar across when you look. The socio backdrop is different. The highest institution in here in Latin America is Banco Colombia. The Colombian government and their regulatory framework on sustainability and their taxonomy, that's come through. I think they led on that from my memory, and that's feeding through. Those nations that have a rich biodiversity nature, they rely on it for their GDP. That's why you see it come through in the environmental footprint. So there is regional variation to this, depending on the different backdrop and of the businesses that are in the benchmark. Next slide. I put this slide here because one of the points that I talk about a lot is you see these sweeping generalizations about finance, but there is a lot of variation across the different subsectors in finance. But for me here, I think the key point to take away is that the blue line is the highest scoring, whereas the bars are the average. There are a big gap. There's a big gap between those that are leading, which is still low. This is scoring out of 100, so nobody has scored over 50. But in terms of the available space for improvement, if we talk about the art of the possible and those that are leading, there is plenty of room for improvement. I do also think what you see reflected here is probably the maturity of reporting. So those subsectors who are used to regulatory reporting outperform those that are less experienced in it. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and alternative asset managers, those are the people that actually have the ability to probably lead in some of these areas, long-term thinking or ability to take greater risk, but actually perform the lowest. Next slide. This here, I put this in here because obviously you need takeaways from here. I will share in the chat as we go or afterwards with participants the detail of our methodology and our scoring guidelines. But in terms of, I think, low-hanging fruit, I called it, that where are institutions scoring the most on governance particularly? When you look down the green sections here, for me, governance, grievance mechanisms, anti-bribery, anti-corruption, some of the points here, this is business as usual. These are already baked into most of the regulation within finance. They come within many of your licensing requirements. So I would expect the institutions to be scoring on those. And if you're not, then I think go and look at our scoring guidelines in terms of what's disclosure and what we're looking for. And that will give you a very specific set of questions that you can be asking of your sustainability teams or those that are doing your disclosures to make sure they're included. But I think where the long-term wins are is actually the lowest scoring indicators are, when I read down these lists, these are the areas that there's a huge amount of discussion that's happening at a multilateral level, at a UN level, at a global level, at a trade association level, that we really do need to come together. Living wage and just transition are some of the fundamental hurdles that need tackling to tackle some of the political issues as well. So there's plenty of scope to come together on those. I'm conscious that I'm on time. I think is there next slide? Yeah. Now, wanted to take, we promised 5 recommendations here. There's an awful lot. I could probably do about 10 or 15. So I've picked 5. My first recommendation for you is, at a moment with what's happening at the moment, obviously we are all digesting what's the news that's happened overnight. As board members, part of your role is taking that long-term lens. System transformational change is glacial, but there need to be champions of it that hold the line on the long-term strategic imperative. This is a structural change that's happening, and board members need to be anchors on that. I've put in here as well about the short-term narrative. There's a lot of discussion about companies pulling back on commitments, but actually we need you to empower those to talk up, to find the narrative that sits in the current external environment that you can still champion sustainability in whatever language that's needed in the operating environments that you're in, but to make sure that everybody in your institution knows strategically it remains a long-term imperative. Second, talk about emerging markets. Now, obviously, I hear a lot about emerging markets being uninvestable, and there's a lot of discussion that's happening in the global about changing the global financial architecture. However, within the existing rules of the game, allocations to emerging market are not there. Money follows the least path of resistance. To invest in emerging markets obviously takes more due diligence and it needs a specific skill set. However, and that needs to be intent. And I think as a board member, as a NED, is driving that intent around allowing resources for investment teams for their due diligence and also innovation. If we get time, I will share what I see happening in blended finance. The finance for development process, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of it. There is a 10-year process that's happening at the moment with government commitments on emerging markets. And many of the issues that are happening in emerging markets will become domestic issues if they're not addressed. I see a huge rallying happening around blended finance. It is still right out there as a frontier subject, but what will happen, it is going to become mainstream. It's just a matter of when. So pushing resources internally into emerging markets, and I'd probably argue nature in there as well, is a part of a long-term vision. Next, thank you. I probably would, I can see this coming out in the questions, that 3% transition planning is about making sure as a board member that you're signaling to your institution the importance of comprehensive transition plan to make sure that you are mandating regular updates to it, so that the reporting isn't getting watered down as it gets to you. I realize that you have a very full list of items on your agenda, but mandating reporting will signal the importance of transition planning internally rather than backpedaling in the environment that we're in at the moment. Next slide. I hope this is already on the agenda. This is so obvious, but I put it in here. We can see that the correlation between executive remuneration and sustainability goals. It's natural human behavior and how we're motivated. We'll be sharing more of this in the report that's coming out later this month. But make sure that your executive remuneration aligns with your goals and it's not contradicting them. There is a lot of work across industry trade bodies on defining this. Obviously, there have been experiences of what doesn't work, and I think there's a lot more leading practices on what does work, but make sure that this is pushed through your remuneration committees. Last slide. And this here is about, on social issues. I know that when I speak to financial institutions, probably one of the questions that we've seen the largest increase in questions on, but actually how to bring this into investment processes. There are some leaders in the benchmark on it, particularly some of the pension funds with dual mandates, but there are also existing initiatives in there. So I would strongly urge that your institution engages with industry initiatives on social issues, and also really importantly with policymakers. The policymakers are grappling with this, and you have visibility into your investment process that they don't. So the link to risk and social stability and financial stability justifies paying attention to this. Right, 5 minutes over time. I need to stop there. There's a list there. You'll have those afterwards. Thank you. Now, I'm very conscious that I have skimmed some very big subjects there. Let's have a look, see what you think about those 5 recommendations, and then very much welcome any questions that come in on this. I can't see the Q&A at the moment. Are there any questions in the chat?
We do have another poll question up on the screen. So if you have got Menti on your browser or on your phone, you can see just at the top of the presentation there, it says join@menti.com, and then there's a code. I'll go back to this Q&R code that you can use as well, so that you can answer that polling question, and we can see what answers we come up with. So yes, okay, you've started to answer. There we go.
Warmly welcome your feelings on these.
And as we're seeing the answers come up on the screen here, it would be great for you to pop in your questions for Andrea in the chats or in the Q&A box, or put your hands up, and yeah, you can ask your questions live. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
It could be a question or thoughts on anything that you've seen in the presentation.
Anything. I am here. I'm conscious that there's a lot that's covered. I do obviously, we can talk through different sectors of finance. If you've got questions on who the leaders are in different sections of finance. Obviously, there is a lot that we have from the assessments, but also WBA, I call us, we're like Switzerland. I like to think we're neutral, which means we can move across different stakeholders. And I have the privilege to speak to people across different financial institutions, across multilaterals, and across other civil society organizations as well. So I'm happy to share my insight from those. I'm really happy to see culture and narrative up there. I think it's such once when we assess the results in 2022, we're still assessing what's come out of the 2025. As you can imagine, we've got a lot of data, but what was really clear, the connection, obviously, between governance and climate, and tone from the top is so crucial. One of the points that I hear coming out with my discussions, and I use the word career risk. I'm not sure if this is, I don't know how correct it is, but because we need to move away from business as usual, and you can set a strategic imperative at a senior level, but for that filter into an organization, it needs to be infused in people's day-to-day jobs. And in finance, because obviously it's highly regulated, it's much safer to do what you've always done. And so to empower people to think differently in their jobs means that they have to understand what the culture is and the direction of travel from the company. So board level narrative that sustainability, be it energy efficiency, that the different language that we use, circularity, translating it into language of finance, but empowering those to think through their work, their investment processes differently, is quite crucial. Do we have some questions?
Not at the moment, but how about we bring in Paul?
There's
and
actually in the
see
chat,
about-
Andrea, there's quite a good one.
Let's have a look.
Let's have a look.
Lacking.
Yes.
Oh, hero, I agree. So I'm a glass half full person, and I think in the current environment, we really do need to champion the leaders. I mean, the whole industry as a whole can do so much more. There's so much intellectual firepower in finance that we really do need to pull that into this. So the leader is CIMB, a Malaysian bank, and I find actually, I won't lie, I'm actually delighted that they're first in the benchmark, and I think it's a reflection that sustainability is strategic for them. They sit in in Southeast Asia where obviously they are going to be greatly affected by climate, but they're in Malaysia. What's happening with palm oil? What's happening on the social side? They are feeling it in their business. I do know from speaking to their CSO as well that it was their focus on sustainability was a board level mandate. And a big push of that as well was for them wanting to engage with international investors and to engage on a global scale. And that's come through. So I congratulate them on it. They're not perfect. They've got a lot to do. But I think that shows what can be done when it's embedded strategically into a bank. Number 2 in the benchmark is ING. Again, I don't think that will probably surprise many people here. They have been embedding sustainability into the bank for years. Again, it's controversial that the number 2, obviously there's litigation that's been going on. One of the points that I know that they struggle with, and obviously they're open with their disclosure, but they're also, that means that they are under the spotlight. And it's something that we grapple with internally and with our peers in other nonprofits. It's like, how do we champion the leaders and make sure that those that take the risk to push on the boundaries are not penalized for that, and those that stay hidden don't. And I think you'll see in the current environment, they're in the collaboration between civil society and that progressive financial institutions is coming closer together.
Just one thing, Andrea. I think one of the things about the ranking, if you like, that we have on the WBA website is the diversity of countries that the leading organizations come from, which surprised me, to be honest.
It was, for me, it was a validation on the methodology. It is a strict methodology. Our scoring is strict. We need to maintain the integrity of how we assess so that we have the confidence of all the different stakeholders that use our data. But the fact that it's varied, for example, the leading asset manager in here is Cathay, which I think is a Taiwanese asset manager. I think they might have some Canadian roots in there, but that Cathay is a Taiwanese group. And I think that for me is is it indicative that it works. Third in the benchmark is NAB, the National Australian Bank. Again, there's still a lot of work to be done, but it shows again in a different jurisdiction that there can be leading practices in there.
It was interesting, Andrea. Actually, only yesterday I'm a judge on some financial awards, and the Bank of Montreal, which are quite high on the agenda.
Yeah.
Again, they're sponsoring something that is very insightful for the future leaders and future, for students in a particular university, etc. It's very noticeable that those sort of banks or organizations are the ones that, particularly nationally, do quite a lot of work with within the community.
Interestingly, BMO were #1 first time round, so they are progressive, they're leaders. And speaking to them, so sustainability, they have it's one of their strategic pillars. I think they have 5 strategic pillars off the top of my head, and that's one of their pillars. And they've also created an academy, I think, because one of the big challenges within finance is the skill set within institutions. This is flexing, this is learning a new muscle that needs flexing outside the sustainability teams and taking it into the wider organization. So BMO, they do score well. I wanted to also touch on I think those that do, I can list through. Actually, you can go into the website and because who are the leaders across the different subsectors. But I think it's interesting also looking at who leads across some of the other jurisdictions as well. Middle East, First Abu Dhabi Bank are leading there. Again, Middle Eastern institutions score very low. They're opaque. I do know moving around them, there is a lot of work that's being done. Where they co-invest what they do, but we can't see it. And I think that's we need to be pulling them in and championing these leading practices. I think the question in there was saying that you're lacking case studies and heroes to inspire you and those leaders. It varies across institution which areas that are leading on. One of the real surprises for me is Bank of America. I think this is off the top of my head. Bank of America come out 2021, 20th in this benchmark. And that was a real surprise for me that it was going to be one of the big SEGs in the US, given the environment that they're in. But when you look at their inclusive finance of what they're doing, and I think, the fallout with the Black Lives Matter, the cost of living crisis, affordable housing, the work that they're doing on gender bonds, and they're sharing it. But they see it as a business imperative. It's obviously interesting what we've seen with Jamie Dimon coming out, talking that DEI is important. He's standing up for it, saying, actually, there's a business case for this. So there are different leaders across different indicators depending on the backdrop, and there are some surprises in there. What I suggest doing, because for each institution in the benchmark, we create a scorecard, a report, and we show what they lead on and where they can improve on. My recommendation is go and look in if you're your own or those that you see as your peer or you aspire to, and see where their leading practice is. And then that will help you narrow down where you go and find case studies. I think it's also worth mentioning a really good source for case studies as well. Those that are aware of it is the impact management platform, IMP. All the different organizations within our ecosystem, so World Benchmarking Alliance and all of our peers, we've tried to create a depository and standardized guidelines, and there are some brilliant case studies on there. So Impact Management Project, I think it's .org, and go in there, you'll find lots of case studies across each step of the impact pathway.
We have another question in the chat, Andrea, from Francesca Lee about banks engaging to mitigate human rights issues in their lending decisions. And I know that you touched upon this a moment ago in your presentation about no climate transition without a social transition. So I don't know if you want to pick up that question from Francesca. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be honest, the banks, the scoring on the banks on human rights issues, leading on those are typically European banks. I'm going to come back on that because I want to give a really specific answer on lending decisions. What we see at the moment typically are pension funds where members have voted, where they specifically want to focus on human rights and social rights, especially pension funds that are worker-led. That's typically where you see the strongest scoring on human rights issues. In lending decisions, I haven't seen that level of transparency yet, but I'm going to loop back on there. So Francesca, please do, if we can pick your details up and then we'll come back on, see if we can come back.
One of the organizations that I'm involved with, which is Shift in the US, which does focus on UN guiding principles of business and human rights, struggles a little bit at the moment with banks and their lending decisions. Because Shift supports banks and others, and it's difficult to support and to have a problem with lending decisions in a human rights sense. So banks are quite a difficult area at the moment. But as Andrea says, it's the lending decisions that is the big issue.
Yeah, and I think this, again, that echoes the point. So when with our indicators and way we score, we look at policy and processes, but where the breakdown is in financing activities. So how it follows through into the book, and obviously that picks up lending decisions. I was going to say something, it's popped out my head. Yes, there's also the Alliance for Financial Inclusion as well, and I know that they are looking at how this gets brought into lending decisions. So I think one of the points as a NED and a board on this is that don't try and reinvent the wheel. There is a lot of resources that sit in the non-profit world that are trying to find best practices and create tools and resources that yourselves can use. So I hope what comes out of this chat is that we can signpost and point you to the right places. I mentioned at the beginning that there will be a report that comes out that follows these initial key findings. And what we do try and do for each section of measurement area is signpost to you where to go and find answers to this. Impact management platform, I think, is a really good starting point. Interesting. Should we, Paul? I'm conscious that I have you, and you and I have some really, we've had some really great conversations. It has really been a privilege the last 3 years getting to know you, and hopefully we can share that with everyone here and your wealth of knowledge. So kind of fireside chat. I'm in spring mode, but I think bring out some of your experience and what's happened in the past and where you are now. When I was a NED on a hedge fund, my experience of it was just I knew everybody in there, and my role, it's very rare that we disagreed. I saw myself very much as just making sure that we're ticking the right boxes from a regulatory perspective, and that there was common sense prevailed. I have an operational background, so that was helpful. When I look at what's happening now in the backdrop and the role of a NED, it's changed dramatically. So, and obviously you've been right, you've experienced that. Really interested what you've seen change of the role of a NED and the expectations from it, and any advice to those that are stepping into it or new to it.
Sure. Well, I've been a non-exec for 20 plus years now. I don't like to think of it, but it is a long time. And in that time, it has changed very much from, I suppose, traditionally compliance type work, and very focused on governance as a main theme. But things have changed quite dramatically, and especially in recent times. I'm not talking about the business in the US. When I say recent times, I mean the last few years. And I think that what's changed is a focus that we used to have, which was on hindsight and oversight, to one where the board and the non-exec is supposed to provide insight and foresight as well.
Yeah.
And that's a very different mindset. And so your traditional, the accountants and the lawyers and the others who are the traditional large company NEDs that are of value are still valuable, but much more in the hindsight and oversight. And I think boards are looking for people who will provide that insight and foresight. And I think it's always been the same, but you can't think in the same way as an executive. And I know I'm teaching, saying things that people are, what's the expression? Teaching people to suck eggs, but it's the same thing. Is that it isn't about how. It's and what is the process in the detail, or helping. It is about helping to make decisions based on broader experience of the world as a whole. I think the other thing that's changed, and I don't see it in all the boards, but I see it in the more active and dynamic boards, is more connection, regular connection with fellow board members and the chair, and making sure that as a non-exec, you're not isolated from stakeholder views. And I think that is something that we all, we've traditionally relied on executives to explain to us what's happening with stakeholder views, and actually the NEDs need to go to be out there and understanding what's going on firsthand.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that leads to one of my recommendations in terms of, who has at the board. Typically the board is kind of, I remember, that the boardroom, it's kind of the ivory tower, and they do need to be out there. Now, it's really interesting because for me, the technical knowledge that's now needed as a NED has exploded. And when we talk about sustainability, and it's constantly rapidly evolving subject, do you think that every NED should be technically competent on sustainability? Especially, I think, typically people come up through the ranks of an organization, you go into senior management, and then you have a portfolio of NEDs as sort of as your kind of the latter career. But, should they have that level of sustainability, or should they be bringing that into the board, have technical expertise coming in? How do you manage that?
I think there are different expertise and different skills that different board members bring in. However, of course, there's a baseline of what people should have a good understanding of. And sustainability is one of those things. I mean, I'm a chartered accountant and a former president of the Institute in Chartered Accountants here in the UK. And whenever I was on a board, if I go back more than 5-10 years ago, it was always, oh, well, are you happy with it, Paul? Because we don't really know, looking at the annual accounts and the management accounts and things. Because if you're happy, we're fine. That quite rightly, that's gone. Now, where somebody like myself might do is interrogate a bit more, yes, about specific things and bring up, highlight things. But a non-exec who hasn't got a basic understanding of a balance sheet is going to struggle in this day and age. And I think that's very much the same, and probably more so now, in terms of sustainability, or how you think of, sustainability can be like that, or it can be as broad as you like. But I think that broad understanding of sustainability is necessary. I think the difference is when you talk about technical knowledge. As an accountant, what is the threshold for income tax in the UK? No idea. I mean, I have an idea, but I don't know. I can't give you a definitive answer, and I think what we're not talking about that detailed expertise. What we're talking about is understanding that there is such a thing as a threshold in where up to which people don't pay tax. That may not be a great example, but it's a thought. But I think what's important to both, I'll say, experienced and inexperienced non-execs, is to appreciate how much has changed. And there is a lot to learn and continues to be. And don't be afraid to seek advice and to educate yourself. I think in the past, and I was guilty of this, I probably thought I knew what I needed to know. Right. As the years have gone on, I know that I don't know what I need to know, and that it's a lot more of that we need to understand. And so the expertise in specifics is useful, but not a prerequisite. It's interesting, but where you need to know things. I mean, again, I've been a non-exec mainly in the UK, and when I was actually on the board of the UK regulator for corporations, and we have the corporate governance code here, and many jurisdictions have corporate governance codes that are as good as the UK, if not better, from what I've seen. But let's understand that in Principle 1A of the Corporate Governance Code, which is what directors' responsibilities is that a company must be led by an effective and entrepreneurial board whose role is to promote long-term sustainable success, generating value for shareholders and contributing to wider society. And I think we have not really grasped that times have changed. And there will be cases, people like Climate Earth and others will call directors to account, non-execs to account, that they make sure they understand their responsibilities. And if it's a private company, you don't get away with it either. There's the Waits principles here in the UK and elsewhere, which refer to the fact that consideration of the company's activities may impact both current and future stakeholders. So I think it's a long answer, but I think it's an important answer that if you aren't aware of those things, you won't really push yourself to learn more about the contribution that companies need to make.
Thank you. I do think, and it's that long-term visionary timeline that's needed. That I think, what is it? There's a Greek proverb here somewhere, but you have to, if you don't change, you're dead. And if companies don't, they are going to fall away, in finance in particular. Now, I do want to touch on something. We can't, the world is turning on is shifted on its axes at the moment. It was really interesting. I read Larry Fink's annual letter earlier this week, and I have to say I thought it was a masterclass in narrative in the current environment. He somehow managed to not mention ESG or sustainability, but really hit tone in terms of prosperity for all and touching on some of these big issues. And I think anybody that hasn't read it yet in finance, go and read it. But I'm interested, Paul, for you, what is absorbing your time at the moment on boardroom discussions? Because sometimes talking about climate externally, let's be real here. It is so polarizing. So how do we move forward on this? What discussions are you privy to that you can share advice on?
It's pretty sad at the moment. It's very difficult at the moment. I think the thing that I've noticed in recent months that I hadn't come across in recent few years, maybe the last 3 or 4 years and the last few months, is what I would call the neutral. So if you're thinking about boards or trustees or whatever it is, where the neutral on just transition, sustainability issues, broader understanding, was not really challenging what the organization was doing. because it was seen as something that was progressing. Of course, the deniers, frankly, I struggle because I can't cope with such people at the moment, but that's just a personal thing. But nonetheless, the deniers haven't changed and have found their voice again. But it's the neutral that I'm most concerned about, is that all of a sudden we're having discussions which we had 5-10 years ago, which had gone away. And I think that is something that has changed significantly. I mean, elsewhere, if you think about what I'm seeing around me, is the big word that's being used, and in fact, it was used a lot in COVID times, is resilience, right? So I was chairman of quite a large insurance broker for many years, and in the insurance broking industry was incredibly resilient during COVID. We actually did well during COVID, not because of COVID, but generally the business succeeded, whereas many businesses, as we all know, struggled. And so the discussion is the resilience of business to all the changes that are being brought about in the current times. I actually missed Larry Fink's letter this year. I remember when it first started, the Larry Fink's letter in our space. It was really very, it progressed from being good to very good to wow. They're moving on a up to a pedestal. I think that's coming down a little.
I think he's found it this year. I think he's found it. He's Marmite. That's a very apologies for those. That's a very English phrase. I think he's Marmite, but
Vegemite, I think in Australia.
Yeah. He has, I think he's nailed it this year because he's talking about wealth, sharing wealth to a wider group. So prosperity for all, and he's focusing on the need to democratize private markets, which I think is a really, assuming we've got a finance audience here, if the debt that exists in the world and where we need to get money to flow, especially into emerging markets. So for me, I think resilience. I think it depends where you're sitting in the world and which part of the finance ecosystem you're in. So I think kind of resilience in one, especially I think like in the insurance sector, I mean, it's critical for them. But I also feel that we are heading into a period of immense innovation in finance. And though you can see it starting to happen, the big institutions are going to create new markets. Because when the role of the finance system, where there's a need for finance, something has that there's a needs to match it, and traditional debt markets aren't going to cover it. So I think that's kind of it's a long-term goal, but I think where do we find a common narrative in a deeply depressing external environment? And I hope it's around innovation.
Okay, so I'm thinking about that.
Yes,
trying to think, because I think at the moment everybody is sort of looking at what they can and cannot say, and whether they want to be bold or not bold. And that's going through the supply chain as well. Which is disappointing. Very disappointing.
I'm interested in awareness of shift in some of the organisations that you work with and you speak to. If you're a NED member that has an international reach, do you think that there is kind of a conflict of interest across different jurisdictions? So, and how do you navigate that as a NED?
I think conflict of interest is a difficult term because it has a legal narrative with it, which is I don't think what you're really meaning. I would rather go with different priorities and cultures across different jurisdictions, and probably the main one being culture in different jurisdictions. In my previous life, I dealt with I was in a very international job in sort of corporate reporting, and actually it was quite interesting. One of your insights before was about Africa, and and the sort of very high in the regional variations, if I remember. And that was, I was very involved with integrated reporting, and that's what came out of Professor Mervyn King in South Africa. And the South African, as I think you said, the South African stock exchange was very influential in being a regulator, in inverted commas, who pushed that forward, which then came into others. But you go to somewhere like Japan, where something like integrated reporting was something that they understood, in terms of broader value creation and understanding value creation. And so for there, I think there's less of a difference than perhaps we have here in Europe, as against other parts of the world. So I think it's hard at the moment to guide through a very confusing picture, which changes every day, if the truth be told. But as the International Accounting Standards, Sustainability Standards Board, I'm trying not to use jargon, the ISSB, as they are finding, it's very difficult to put standards across jurisdictions. And that's the same for global organizations, where they have to be sensitive to the culture and the priorities of those different jurisdictions.
That's interesting. And that plays out what I see as I speak to institutions across different continents. A really stark one for me. It was interesting that on the first poll, like, was it fiduciary duty, risk, opportunity? I see a mirror, that the conversations that I'm having with executives in Europe is much more risk focused, because that is the natural, I think, language that are used in terms of managing risk. And perhaps that's what that translates into investment portfolios as well, where risk has a higher prominent risk management. And when I'm talking to Asian institutions, and as you know, I lived in Asia for a long time, much more of that is driven by opportunity, the language of opportunity, the language of growth. It's a stronger driver. Like, we will take the risk if the opportunity is there. So I think the language that gets used, if you're a NED in one jurisdiction or another, is making sure culturally you're shifting to the backdrop of the ecosystem that you're operating in. And for me, I mean, Paul, interesting, you see, like, the evolving definition of fiduciary duty. Like, we know the legal definitions of prudence and loyalty. So I think, and loyalty, digging into my technical knowledge here, is a bit rusty. But I notice a different interpretation of fiduciary duty depending on which continent I'm standing on, which financial institution.
Yes, and things like corporate governance code I mentioned before, but in the investor world, the stewardship codes that are going across the world, where neither of those have a global standard, if you like, code. They tend to be on a national basis. But stewardship codes, I remember when I was at the regulator here in the UK, the debate about fiduciary duty and stewardship within the investment communities were endless, right, and very hard to define. But in fact, there were two members of the regulator board who were the managing directors of major asset managers and in the UK, and large asset managers, were fully on side and wanted to make sure that there was some boundaries, if you like, that made sure that we were looking not just within the boundary of the traditional fiduciary duty boundary, but actually exploring more broadly about what their role is. And I think that has been a very effective change. And I just dread what might happen in the next few years, is it? One hopes it's not years, but I dread to think what might happen in that on that. So it's a difficult situation, but I do agree with you on the fiduciary duty. In fact, Professor Robert Eccles in the US did a huge amount of work a few years ago about fiduciary duty in different countries and started to bring it all together. I'm not sure it ever actually came to a conclusion that everybody agreed with, but it was very interesting work, and I think where those sorts of interesting work come to the fore is that it is by country, and therefore you can dig in. It's almost like research, knowing what's going on.
I'm conscious that I'm hogging you, Paul, and I'm hoping I couldn't see any questions in the chat. Does somebody want to ask a closing question of Paul? Because I always enjoy speaking with him. Otherwise, I'll squeeze one last one in.
Andrea, can I ask you a question?
Oh, go on then.
I mean, you've been deeply embedded in all of this over the last 3 years at the WBA and before. Where would you see the financial system moving to in the next few months?
Oh, in the next few months, I see. It's all shaking out at the moment and waiting for where everything's going to land. I see it, the narrative's pivoting, but the intent is still there. So I see it will be picking their fights. I use this phrase quite a lot, going with gravity, because there are certain issues, for example, on there's a lot that's happening obviously on climate, on energy efficiency. So it'll be around translating sustainability into the business case, and then we will see the scale there. So I can see a sharpening of the narrative. One of the things that I see where I move around, the deal makers are in the room. So the economics are going to play out. And the money is that the finance will carry on, but I think the narrative is going to shift, and I think long term it is unstoppable. So I think impact and finance is coming closer together.
One of the things that I've noticed in various discussions I've had within organizations is, do we change our website? Do we change our what the as you call it, the narrative, or I would call it the language that we use? Do we exclude DI? Do we do all of these sorts of things without, and is it possible to do all of that without, in the slightly, I would call it the medium term, not being able to go back to it?
I think it's evolutionary. And I think where you think what's happened, I've been through CSR, ESG when it first came in, and it's come through. I think it's a constant evolution, and this is a hump. But I think what comes out of the other side of this will be sharper.
Because as I see it, even in the short term, stepping back from sustainability priorities is terribly sad, especially with the urgency that's needed. And I would say probably sad isn't the right word, it's tragic. Going back to Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Bank of England, he used to talk about the tragedy of the horizons. That we didn't understand that what we're doing today is so important, and we can't just wait till tomorrow. And I think, that's why when I asked the question, it was about in months, because my worry is that we'll go backwards, and then it'll be very hard to accelerate the way we need to. And in financial services, in its in the broadest sense, the entities that are potentially not fit for purpose, if we're not careful, in this challenging world, are in danger of being coming to the fore. And my message is that, you know, is that it's immediately in front of us and not something that's long term, or medium term, or even, you know, a couple of years. And I'm deeply, if I'm honest, I'm deeply concerned about where we're heading at the moment, and how we get back to the sort of the momentum that there has been in recent times.
I think, yeah, I hear I have to be optimistic, as I wouldn't get up every morning and do what I do. I think my message for the NEDs here is legacy, because a lot of people, when you're in as a NED, you're bringing together your professional experience and your life experience and that judgment into role of a NED and being visionary, and just, you know, thinking about the legacy that you're leaving, and maybe being courageous, and also sharing, making sure that you speak up and you share that judgment and that knowledge also with the younger, with your younger colleagues that are coming through. But that's what pushes you through those hard moments.
And I agree. I mean,
thank you. I'm so sorry, we are going to have to wrap up, and I really want to end on that lovely, positive, optimistic note there from Andrea, and just to say thank you so much, Andrea and Paul, to you both for being here. Just so many fantastic insights from the benchmark and how our financial system is doing on sustainability, but also what it's like to be a board director working to lead from the top. So we really appreciate your time. I haven't moderated today, Andrea has, but I'm leaving that there so that you can stay in touch with CGI's financial sector programme to participate in some of the events we're coming up over the year, including things like going deeper into navigating anti-ESG headwinds, scenario planning, and seeing the net zero transition in action and how to participate. You can also stay in touch with your local chapter on what training, resources and events they have for boards as well. So thank you so much again to Andrea and Paul. Really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for everyone that was here and asked questions, and we'll see you again very soon.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure.